Hello everyone, or maybe Privyet might be appropriate, because today Dr. Simon Peaple is back with us as we talk about the Russian Revolution and some of the work on it by McMeekin. So, see you over there. Oh, welcome back to the programme.
Thank you for having me back.
So, as we're talking about the Russian Revolution in this video, there's a quote that about Sean McMeekin's book, The Russian Revolution, A New History, written by, and this quote coming from an article in the London Times by Michael Gove, and part of it, what he wrote is, quote, "And the revolution was an object lesson in how liberals can lose, and lose catastrophically, from a position of great advantage, if they are divided in the face of a ruthless ideological foe." So, as a historian of this time period, do you have any thoughts on how far it was a case of, as they call them, liberals losing from a great position of great advantage?
I think the difficulty that one can have with these situations is that one can have a very clear view as to who you'd like to have won. And it's clear that McMeekin saw the Bolsheviks as a very bad thing, and therefore that it was a great shame that they won. And it tends to draw this picture, or this what the impression got, is that there's a picture of the good guys and the bad guys, and the bad guys are the Bolsheviks, and to describe them as ruthlessly ideological is obviously quite reasonable. However, you'd have to then take into account the practicality and say, Lenin's decision to seize power was certainly a working through of the idea of the vanguard of the proletariat, in the sense of, there wasn't that big a proletariat in Russia, and the vanguard that was supporting the communist views of Lenin was even smaller than that, and so seizing power was an ideological thing. That's not an issue. I think the question you then have to focus on, as you've indicated, is how far the liberals threw it away. And I think, to my mind, that one can challenge how strong their position really was, and that's quite an important factor to take into account in assessing that. And then secondly, the idea that they were liberals, because some of the people might or might not constitute liberals in a wider Western European sense. So we can take those 2 points. But I think the first and most important one is to consider how far the position of the provisional government was indeed strong, because I think that's pretty key. And so if we take, first of all, what would have made a liberal government strong? Well, the first thing that you might look for, if you were assessing that position, was the traditions in Russia. Did they have a tradition of representative government? Did they have a tradition of political parties that sought to provide some kind of middle road political tradition? So, obviously, the first thing to say is clearly Russia did not have that democratic tradition. So, the constitution that's granted after the 1905 revolution, which of course wasn't a revolution because people stayed in power, but by relative terms could be described as a revolution, or certainly an attempted one. 1905, we've got the creation of the Duma, the idea of a representative assembly, one that goes back, you could say Muscovite history, back to Nizhny Novgorod and the boyars later on and so But in reality, there had not been a representative tradition in the Russian tradition. Right? It was an autocracy. It didn't even have the level of consultation that you saw in France under the Ancien regime. There was no equivalent of the Estates General turning up to advise the sovereign. It was an autocracy. So the first thing that you'd have to say is that any government, any democratic liberal government, would have weak soil in which the roots of a group gaining power by popular support would have that claim on power. So that's the first thing. No tradition. You know, if the same thing had happened in 1917 in Britain, as some people then feared, you know, you could say, well, hang on a minute, there's a tradition that we have representation. Even if it had been limited, it had nonetheless been limited by class, but it was there for many hundreds of years, albeit constrained by various restrictions. But, you know, in 1917, someone in Britain taking power on the basis of a wide democratic franchise, of sudden sort of decision to hold a general election, which had been deferred in 1915. You know, if the Labour Party or whoever had come to power in 1915, or in a delayed election in 1917, there was a tradition. Oh yes, that's what happens in this country. We have a vote. Whoever wins takes power till the next time we have a vote. That wasn't the case in Russia. You know, the provisional government had come to power because of the fall of the Tsar. Why had the Tsar fallen? Because of the huge weaknesses of the autocracy, which you can go back, you know, at least as far as 1825 if you look at some of the, you know, quotes, long fuses of the revolution. But if you leave aside some of that and just look at the period from, say, 1905 onwards, you know, the way in which the Russian state had operated left the Tsar very weak. And yes, you can go into all the stuff about Rasputin and the Tsarevich and so on, but fundamentally Russia was struggling. It was struggling to be one of the great powers of Europe with a weak economic base. It was having to spend more. It wasn't quite as bad as Austria-Hungary, but then nobody was. So, you know, yes, it wasn't fifth of the great powers, but it was probably fourth. Having to search for huge amounts of money in order to generate the kind of great power accoutrements, large armies, well-equipped armies, armies with modern quick-firing guns, etc., etc., etc. And so the Russian state was weak anyway. It couldn't exert control over its people terribly well. You have all the industrial unrest coming up to the First World War, the Lena gold strikes and various other things, but bitter industrial relations, absolutely horrible. But that leaves aside the 90% of Russians who are still peasants. And how badly had the government dealt with land reform? You know, the Tsar liberator Alexander II had liberated the serfs. But what had he done? He compensated all the landowners. The landowners were then you know, freed up from the responsibility of managing the people, but the people were then paying the taxes to pay the government back for the money spent giving the landowners the compensation for the serfs' freedom. And so the serfs were freed, but then tied back to their local area by the need to pay collectively for the liberation. Now, that meant that you had real problems in villages because people couldn't leave. So, you know, the argument is that in the Industrial Revolution in Britain or whatever, large numbers of people left the land because they were being made redundant by the Agricultural Revolution, and therefore they provided the labour that went into the factories that began the Industrial Revolution. Lots of other factors, but you know, that's one. So Russia is really struggling. Its agricultural economy is not very efficient. it's great in certain parts but not in others. So the Ukraine produces huge amounts of grain, but when that can't be exported during World War One, that causes huge problems. So you've got the difficulty that any government of Russia is struggling to rise to the challenge of being a great country without modern reforms. Now, Stolypin did some of them, tried to do some of them, certainly the encouragement of the peasants to develop their own land ownership and systems and so on, to bring on the peasants, the ones who later will be attacked by Stalin as the kulaks. There were chances to reform, to develop, but it wasn't very popular. And there's clear examples of where people didn't take up all the Stolypin reforms because they first of all started the process, but then the village would say, no, you can't do that, we'll ostracise you from the village, and that wasn't easy. So land reform is struggling, industrialisation is struggling because, same as in Britain and every other country, the first phase is pretty brutal. People are being moved from, get up in the morning, till your fields, come home, to arriving at a certain time, finishing at a certain time, masses of people, jobs that, often were brutal, that in living conditions were horrible, so there's a real economic issue. And then the war comes along. And the Tsar's got pretty much no idea. I mean, if you look back to the argument about people, Nicholas II, the classic sort of analogy is that he would have made a decent country squire in Norfolk, managing his estates, largely with somebody else telling him what to do, and he would have been perfectly all right as an English country gentleman, but he was completely out of his depth running Russia. So he goes into the war in this vain belief that the Romanovs are beloved of their people, that if only the peasants can meet their Tsar, they'll forget all about their difficulties and they'll love him. He goes into the war thinking that'll great, that'll cement the pan-Slavism. Now, that doesn't work. So Russia has an appalling war. It's easy to forget that there were some successes. Brusilov in 1916, they managed to beat the Austro-Hungarians on a number of fronts in 1914, 15, 16. But the trouble was that if you can only beat the Austro-Hungarians, you're really not proving very much. And the consequences of the Germans bolstering the Austro-Hungarians is one, of course, that they can't win outright on the Western Front. But secondly, the Russians are now in a losing war because they're up against the best equipped, in many ways, and certainly the best trained military. And the Eastern Front, even though it does develop some trenches in certain parts, nonetheless is more of an area of open manoeuvre. And for the Germans, with their staff training and so on, that was better. So the Russian army, for a number of reasons which we haven't got time to go into today, struggles in World War One. And then you've got the Tsar, who's taken them into the war, unable to rule the country very effectively, and is then associated with defeats. And those defeats are closely associated with him when he decides to become Commander-in-Chief and take over from his uncle, who's at least a professional soldier for whose career has focused on the army. So from that point onwards, every defeat is a defeat for the Tsar as the head of the army, as much as it is for the army. So when it comes to 1917, all of these things come together to bring the Tsar down. So first of all, if you want to sort of think it through in terms of detail, you get the bread riots. Right? Inflation during 1914, 15, 16 is horrendous. It just wipes out any gains that people have had in the incomes they're paid in the Brutilov Arms Works and other various places. So the Putin, they're making more money, but their cost of bread is out. That's why it's the women who come out, because they're the ones trying to feed the kids, as so often. Whatever the men are doing, the primary care responsibilities with the women. And what's happening? They're going to the shops, and if there is stuff there, it's too expensive. They can't afford it. So they get angry. They want bread. They want to be fed. And one reason why they can't be fed is the transport system's broken down. I mean, in theory, the Ukrainian grain fields couldn't be exported out through Constantinople to earn foreign currency, but at least they could have been used to feed the Russian people. First of all, the peasants are reluctant to let go of surplus grain, understandably, because they don't want to be left with nothing to eat, having grown it. But also, after the first offensive by the Russians, which defeats the Austro-Hungarians, it does brilliantly in 1914, the railway system begins to come to a complete halt. The army has got priority for everything, unsurprisingly, but a lot of trained men are killed because of conscription. As with other countries, when it comes to World War II, people say, don't conscript all the really skilled people because we need them to do other things. And actually they're just as important doing those other things. But in the First World War, it was like everybody off to the front. Therefore, skilled engineers, the kind of people who maintain rolling stock aren't there. So the rolling stock gets damaged, it's not replaced. So it's not able to bring food to the cities. And that's what gives Lenin and Co the opportunity in the cities, is the cities are not being fed. So in early 1917, the women go on the streets and they are demanding food. Now, if you go back to 1905, what did the Tsar have? He had a loyal army. He could bring in peasants from peasant units of his army drawn from faraway places and tell them to shoot the beam in St. Petersburg, or the officers will. And they will. They will open fire. If you look at 1917, you have a big problem. They've just told the Petrograd garrison that it's going to be called up to the front because the Germans have advanced and it's now there. Now, who's the garrison troops in 1917? It's not going to be a young, fit, youngest men, is it? No. Your garrison troops are your third tier, older, married, families, from somewhere else, probably not from anywhere near Petrograd, but they are nonetheless fathers, older men, men who were in categories that were lower down when the mobilisation took place. So therefore, what's going to happen next? You're going to say to them, we want to shoot these women who are trying to feed their kids. And they're going like, well, of course they want to feed their kids. There's no sense of a difference between the soldiers and the people. And, let's be honest about it, what was the situation for the Russian army? The Russian army was suffering something around 70 to 75% casualties during the First World War. Way higher than other armies because of the nature of the way that they had been taken. Numbers had gone as prisoners, some of them had been very badly led on different occasions, so that was the situation. Now, that means that every of them, 4 men standing in a line facing up to demonstrators, they know that 3 of them will be killed, wounded or captured if they go to the front. Now, if that's the case, that's when you start to think, I don't want to go to the front. Soldiers have always known there were casualties, but they have to feel, unless it's particular circumstances, particular elite group, but in a mass conscript army, you have to feel that the number of casualties is not so high that it's got to be you. Right? But you could stand with your 3 mates in that line in Petrograd and thinking, is it going to be me? Or am I going to be one of the 3 out of 4? So the government fails because the army will not now suppress those who want change. And then Nicholas gets intercepted as he comes back on the train. His special train gets intercepted and sidelined, and he's told he's got to step down. All of that, broadly speaking, would be agreed. You can argue about the relative economic and political, personal issues that went towards that downfall. But that's what happened. That did not give the liberal elements within Russian politics the way to govern Russia. It did not give them the right, the mandate to govern Russia. It merely said, we don't want the Tsar. Now, for that to be communicated to the Tsar required the democratic politicians from the Duma to go and say to him, you're out. But it didn't give them a mandate. So it's very hard to argue that they threw away something from great advantages. What advantage did they have? An electoral mandate is what gives an elected government strength. People chose them. The Duma, by the time of the last elections to it, before the war, was on a very restrictive franchise. It wasn't just once, it was 4 times after 1905 and the initial elections. The government moved to change the qualifications. So this is a Duma elected on a narrow basis, which has been narrowed 3 more times. So they don't have a mandate, they don't have that opportunity. Now, they are in power. They have been told they're in charge. But in charge of what? If you haven't got the transport systems to exert your authority, what do you do? It's not that straightforward. To take the parallel that we alluded to earlier, if the delayed election had been held in 1917 in Britain, what might have happened? We don't know. We can speculate. But whoever came to power would have had, first of all, an elected mandate, and secondly, critically, control over the army and of the transport systems. Because A, the distances were much smaller, and B, special powers had already been taken. So, they were there in power. But the liberals in Russia, were they in power? Or were they just responsible? That's a question you might want to ask. And then the next thing that you'd have to say is, and what situation did they inherit? The First World War for the Russians had started effectively, you could argue, on the 1st of August of 1914. This was February 1917. Large numbers of casualties, no real gains to speak about, or where there were small territorial gains, they were offset by losses elsewhere. So here was a government coming to power, or at least into office, with no mandate yet and no opportunity to govern on the biggest stage because it's caught up in the war. At which point you have to say, well, what's the choice? Do you go with the war, which nobody wants? Whatever McGeekin's view of Lenin, the reality is that he understood what people wanted when he said bread, peace and land. That's what people wanted. They wanted to be able to feed. They wanted to have peace. And they wanted a redistribution of land. All those things were exactly what the electorate wanted. So what does the provisional government do? First, it decides that it's going to continue the war. So this war, which is causing huge problems to the Russian people, which is disrupting their food supplies, which is distorting the economic base, and which is causing huge casualties, is going to be carried on. Now, you could argue that they were in a difficult position. How do you tell your allies you're going to bail out? After all, the Entente had stomached being allied with Tsarist Russia, but it didn't expect the new government to be less patriotic than the old government. But there was always the possibility of real gain for Russia, if you were a bit naive to think that they were doing well, or to be able to see that the Germans would fail. Because Britain, for example, had said with the Dardanelles that it was not going to give that land to Greece. It's one of the reasons why Greece took so long to enter the war. They said it was going to go to Russia. So if you're part of a Slavophile, intellectual group of probably upper middle class people who share those beliefs about Russia and its greatness, but who don't approve of one person running the country, then you want to carry on the war. But if you want to carry on the war, you have just made it impossible to govern Russia much better than it was already being governed. Now, then they get the situation where they have the July days, the Bolsheviks over-egg themselves, and the government's able to disarm them. At that point, they have a chance to defeat the Bolsheviks, but that's not the same as being able to have a mandate to run the country. It just means they can take out one small opposing group. Thinking about it, as a whole, what advantages did they give away? They said they would have elections. Okay, that's a good start. You could argue that that does suggest things are better. But when you think how well organised elections are in Britain, and Britain isn't holding them during a war, can you see how problematic it is to hold elections in the situation they're in? And that's why they schedule them. They're scheduled for the January of 1918, and they're going to have elections. Wonderful, great. What's it doing about solving any of the problems? Are they getting the grain in? Are they able to feed the people? Because it's wonderful to have grandiose philosophical ideas about a real parliament that would meet, that would have real power. Fine, nothing wrong with that. But how long have you got running the country? Very difficult, very different. So those are things which I think we really need to challenge as to whether they threw away an advantage in 1917. If you don't feed the people, if you don't end the war, then people are going to start thinking you're the same, or the same in enough essentials. And does it matter if I've got a vote, if I can't afford a loaf of bread to feed my family? And that is one of those fundamental issues you have to come back to. So I'm not sure that you can support the idea that you can throw away an advantage when actually you haven't got an advantage. You've come into power at a very difficult time with a huge number of conflicting demands being placed on you. And what do? You choose to do the thing that will keep all your allies happy, that makes it look like you're part of a great liberal democratic tradition, fighting the autocratic Prussians, fighting the elements within Russia who would like to go back to pre-1905. All of those things. But not dealing with it and therefore leaving themselves open. And yes, Lenin is ruthless. Yes, they take power in Petrograd where they actually have some support, but that's not really the key to the question about them giving it away. They were in an absolutely rotten, poor situation, and they didn't end the war, and everything else stemmed from that. I hope that's been helpful and enlightening.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for not barking during the interview.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that was useful and enlightening.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Peaple, for joining us today, and I hope everyone had a good time learning, and it was lovely having you here.